Thank you. All right, I'd like to go ahead and call this work session to order, a confirmation hearing for the Chief Equity Officer. Now let's go ahead and start with the roll call, please.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
Miss Allard.
Ms. Allard is excused.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
Ms. Kennedy is excused.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Presberdia. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Ms. Zolotel.
Ms. Zolotel is here but unable to respond verbally at the moment.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. As usual, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text to me if you can't access the chat. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the administration to do an introduction of their appointee, and then we will turn it over to Mr. Clifford Armstrong III after that introduction.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair. We're really excited today to introduce you to Clifford Armstrong III. Clifford comes to us via Tacoma, where he's been doing equity work for several years, and I know he'll tell you more about that. He and his wife is from Homer, I believe, and we're planning to move back to Alaska and Anchorage generally, and it was our good fortune that the timing lined up that he could help us get this important work done. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the process by which we made this selection and are bringing Clifford to you today for confirmation. Jason and I decided that we felt, since this position not only would be important for the Muni, but for our entire community, that we wanted to start the process from the beginning by engaging different members of our community. So we invited Ayu Kasatek from First Alaskans Institute and Jasmine Smith from the Business Boutique and Black Chamber of Commerce to participate in the entire selection process with us. We received applications, reviewed them together, selected who to interview, made a selection for a second interview where we interviewed a couple of folks. They actually did a presentation. We sort of a mock scenario, and we got to see them in action. And Clifford, we couldn't be more excited about a candidate than we are about Clifford. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chair, and we'll get started.
Great, thank you. All right, the floor is yours now, Clifford, if you want to go ahead, introduce yourself and tell us what you would like to say.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And so I guess I'd just like to start off by saying I'm very humbled and honored to be offered the position. As the mayor said, my wife is from Homer, and we were moving up to Anchorage. I believe, I had my first and second interview while my house in Tacoma was full of boxes. My second interview was, I think, the day we were actually physically moving ourselves up. So it was a bit chaotic, but very fortuitous timing. As I do have a lot of experience in equity work. In my last position with the city of Tacoma, I created what's called the Equity and Contracting Program, which is a race and gender conscious contracting requirement program. But I'd say that's a very it's where a lot of places want to get. It's a very long process to get there. And so, I'm sure I'll get the opportunity through your questions to talk about what processes we can engage in here in Anchorage that don't necessarily need to be mandatory requirements and things, but actually just by removing maybe barriers that we've implemented are able to, really, really contribute to the community in a positive way.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Okay, we will go ahead and turn it over to any questions from the members. So I I don't see anyone in the queue. I'll go ahead and just put myself in the queue then. And then if any other members have questions, please feel free to put yourself in. A couple of questions for me. First is, after reviewing the job description, the job description sounds fairly enormous. It sounds huge. It sounds like there's a lot there to unpack and to do, and the expectations, I think, for this position, both from the administration, from the assembly, and then from the public, from our community. I think there are some pretty high expectations. So it's almost like having one person do the job of four. How do you see yourself handling all of this that is sort of being thrown on your lap? No pressure.
Yeah, it is a very broad. It was a very broad job description, but fortunately, I've actually, in some way, shape, or form, done every single thing that was listed in the application already through my current or previous work. So, I think for it, I don't have the job description open in front of me, but the main thing to say is that obviously I'm just one person, and I view all of the kind of functions laid before me have one kind of underpinning, which is kind of pointing the direction and being a ship captain, so to speak, and to developing a more equitable Anchorage in whatever way, shape, or form that comes to pass. I'm more or less ambivalent about the process so long as the mission is accomplished. And that lends itself towards a lot of different possibilities. So whether, I have experience in the past working on federal grants, applying for additional funds for programs. I've, as I previously stated, developed the policy for, and then managed race and gender conscious programs before. I've done facilitations and trainings for folks on, not just equity in general, but also, power dynamics and other sorts of things of that nature. I've served on a lot of, I've served on boards, been a part of community organizations, and generally speaking, I think, like I said, I've done everything that is kind of expected. I think really initially for me, the main question is, what is the data that we'll come to find, and the community connections and where the community is, that will determine how it is we'll move forward. But I think the objective and the mission it's going to be accomplished. It's just a matter of what the process is to get there.
Great, thank you. I have one more question, and then just want to note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. LaFrance. So can you tell me a little bit about some of your experience in bringing community members to the table and that collaborative process? I can tell you here in the municipality of Anchorage, there is a strong desire, can't emphasize that enough, of having community members at the table. So if you could speak to your experience on that, that would be wonderful. Also want to note for the record that we've been joined by Miss Allard. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have, as I said, a wealth of experience in involving community in various processes in my role as a city, as well as in my personal time. I was a community engagement chair for a nonprofit called the Rainier Valley Corps in Seattle, which, for those who are unfamiliar, it's a localized form of AmeriCorps run by Voulay, who is probably one of the most popular nonprofit directors or EDs in the Northwest. And at the city of Tacoma, when we were developing our programs, we had our data, we had our disparity study performed, but we actually spent a year after that involving the community, and not just community organizations and community members, but also the business community, the contracting community, and had a years-long work group to shape the policy that we had. So again, we knew what we wanted to do as a city. We knew where we wanted to get, but we also spent the time engaging the community and having the community input be a part of what it is that we do. Because ultimately, what we can and can't do as a city or as a municipality it's really contingent on how well the community also engages in the process.
Great. Thanks so much. Next, I have Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I have about 3 questions, and so I'll ask them one at a time. And then, Chair, if you would like to, as Mr. Weddleton said, is give me the hook. I'm happy to hop back in the queue. My first question is, could you talk with me a little bit about how you view equity as it intersects with disability and gender issues and race? Like, can you talk a little bit about intersectionality and how that affects work when you're working toward equitable policies?
Yeah, definitely. So the first thing I'll say is, and I won't be able to fully explain it in the time provided here. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to have a more in-depth conversation about it. But the way that I view equity is that it is a function of inclusion and diversity. And diversity it changes with respect to what subpopulation you're talking about. So when you're saying intersectionality, or when you have issues of intersectionality, it's when you may have discrepancies in the distribution of some resource or the distribution of some outcome based upon multiple different types of diversity. But when you're building programs and building policies as a government agencies, you have to be extremely specific about what group you're talking about as narrowly as possible. And so, one of the things that I would propose probably doing within the first 1.5 to 2 years is really being able to develop something like an equity index, which is what we built in Tacoma as well, which allows you to look at different subpopulations specifically. And then if you see that multiple subpopulations all have some negative distribution of outcomes, then that lets you know that that's probably should be something that's prioritized. So that would be how I answer that first question. I hope that answers it well enough for you.
Thank you. Am I fine to go ahead with my next question, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is, what do you think are the most pressing issues of equity post-pandemic, post-COVID-19? I guess I've been doing a lot of reading about how different populations and different outcomes have really been affected by the pandemic, and I would love to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is that COVID has basically reified a lot of the inequities that we already have. So when it comes to medical outcomes, obviously people of color and Alaska Natives, I would imagine here, are suffering a bit more from that than other folks. Then also in terms of education, so folks who don't have the ability to participate in schools in the same way, and this is broadly speaking. I can't speak to this specific community because I haven't spent the time yet, but certainly in Tacoma and certainly in a lot of areas that I have paid attention to, the education gap that already existed has certainly been exacerbated due to people's lack of access to technology, lack of people being able to stay home from work because of the type of work that they have, or people who have to stay home but they can't work because they have to work in person and they don't have the funds or the economic security to afford childcare. And it also kind of more so affects women in that way, unfortunately. So, I've read quite a few different studies about the impact that COVID has had on women's income in aggregate, when it still wasn't on balance, but it was getting better, but certainly now has been pushed back decades. So those would be some initial things that I'd point out specifically.
Great, thank you. My last question is, you had mentioned, kind of getting toward the goal of a more equitable Anchorage or an more equitable municipality, right now, and I understand you're not here right now, but right now, what does that mean? What does that mean to you in terms of a more equitable Anchorage, and how do you balance that against what might be, this position is unique in that it works with the assembly and the mayor's office, where that could be 12, 13 differing views of what equitability means for the municipality. So, how do you juggle the competing views also with kind of helping create a unified view?
Yeah, so I think the place to start is with a common definition of exactly what equity is and exactly what inclusion is and exactly what diversity is. And working from that common definition, I think everybody would agree that they want people to be free from discrimination or be free from the any sort of negative outcomes that might be predetermined because of some factor that they were born into and couldn't control, or some other sort of societal ill. So I think really it's a question of prioritization that I would say might be an issue. But if we're working from a common definition, there won't be a lack of understanding that one inequity doesn't exist so much. It's more of a concern of this might be the inequity that matters to me or you in this case as an assembly member. And then we'll have to figure out how we balance those priorities is what I'd say. But I am a strong proponent, and I do have, as I said, kind of very specific definitions of equity, inclusion, and diversity that mean exactly one thing. That way there is no confusion about what it is that we're talking about when we use these words in this language, and that makes it very actionable and very easy for folks to understand, I think, and then be able to implement and strategize around, implement programs and strategize.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Alatel. Next in the queue, I have Mr. Constant.
Hello there, sir. I am glad to welcome you to the conversation. My name is Christopher Constant. I serve the downtown district, one of the more urban districts in town. And so I'm going to ask a question, and it's not a reflection of my values. I fully support the question of equity and working to build equity in the municipality. But we have and continue at times to hear from members of the community at large that we shouldn't be focusing on equity. We should always have neutral policies that just don't look at those things and instead just kind of accept that things are good. What's your thoughts on how to approach that whole set of the community that we all recognize exists and has a strong voice?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the first thing that I'd say is, it's not necessarily in either or type of situation. There are lots of different types of inequities, and they're not necessarily all race and gender based, right? There's a lot of outcomes that again, in Tacoma, we also have women business enterprise programs, right? And requirements around women business ownership and utilization of women-owned businesses, because we did a study and we're able to show exactly what the disparity was between the availability of women-owned businesses in different categories of contracting opportunities and what the city over a 5-year period had actually done. And those disparities were quite large. And then we also, and this, this might be something that you hear me say again in the future, is that there's a process for addressing these sort of these equitable or inequities in these issues, which is that first you have to be able to prove that they exist, right? And you prove that things exist by having well-defined studies and well-defined data that speaks to a particular issue, so that everybody can see exactly what the problem is and how bad of a problem it is, if it exists at all. And then you have to address such things in neutral ways. So to the folks that may want to suggest that that's what we do, I actually agree, because that's a part of the process. You have to try to solve things, even if they may have race and gender conscious outcomes, or there may be race and gender based outcomes. You do actually, legally speaking, need to try to address them specifically in a race and gender neutral way, and then have that fail. And then you can engage in what are called narrowly tailored options to race and gender such things. So, and that's why I said, it's not an either or. That's actually a part of the process. So that's what what I would say to somebody who may have some opposition, is that doing things that are on par neutral is exactly what you have to do first.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate you use the word actionable, because I think that our assembly has a strong bias towards action.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Hearing no more questions, I do have one more.
Go ahead.
When would you be arriving? What's your timeline?
Actually, I'm already in Anchorage. I'm somewhere around like 12th and Cordova. Somewhere around there. Yeah, so I've been here for a few weeks now, and I'll be starting on Monday, doing orientation on Monday, assuming everything goes well here today.
All right. Well, I look forward to the opportunity of taking you for a kind of firsthand tour of your neighborhood and the district, and narrating to you some of the challenges that I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Well, thanks. So I'll welcome you as well. And it's a good day to be in Anchorage. It's gorgeous out. So some of these things we say actions, well, things like, if we don't have, racial balance in our workforce or something like that. I mean, do you assign quotas, or how do you get from here to there if there's a problem?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely difficult to say exactly what you should do specifically in any hypothetical scenario, but I will say the process needs to be consistent. And I kind of just spoke to what that process needs to look like. So if you want to use the example of like a racial disparity in hiring, let's say, and specifically hiring by the municipality itself, right? First, you have to prove that there's a problem. So we're going to need to have that evidence. The municipality will obviously have its own data regarding, who's on staff and who's not, but that is not necessarily the question directly. You need to also know what is the relative availability of various races, because again, we're just using the topic of race here, but various races in the work pool for each work category or solicitation that you have. And so that means that you need to understand what your market is. Is this something that you only generally recruit people from the state of Alaska from, or does it extend nationally? If so, you're going to have to get a lot more data to be able to say exactly what that number should be or should look like. And then even then, you don't actually use such a thing as a quota per se. and again, you'd have to do something that's race and gender or race neutral. You'd have to look at your own policies and procedures to see if there's things that have caused an inequity that are a result of a process that you've made. But assuming that there isn't, right, just to make an assumption that there isn't, and you're not doing anything discriminatory yourself, then what you would need to do is have, in this case, it would be whatever specific races are underutilized. So it wouldn't be everybody in general. It would have to be very specific to the data. You would use that as an additional category in your candidate selection pool, which is to say that if you, for example, put out a solicitation for a job, and I'll try to use the most basic thing possible. So let's just say maybe it's a janitorial thing. It's a janitorial job, and there's a particular the only requirement that you have lifted, or the only requirement you have on the job solicitation is that somebody has to be able to lift 50 pounds, right? So if you get 10 candidates, and of those 10, 5 can lift 50 pounds and 5 cannot, then you're going to have a pool of 5 candidates who all meet your requirements, right? So you're going to have 5 equally qualified candidates. And from that pool of equally qualified people, you can then use race as an additional selection criteria. But in no way, shape, or form may you ever pick somebody, use that selection criteria to take somebody who didn't meet the requirements over people who did. And so that, again, is a very basic rundown of process around that. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
It does. Yeah, that's good. And Chair, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure, go ahead.
So you use the word race neutral, and this is the thing is I'm an old white guy on the assembly, and we grew up and we say be colorblind, and that was the rally call that we gathered and tried to live by for many decades now. And now we're hearing no. You need to take account of race in every single thing we do because we have problems, and we saw problems last summer. So clearly something's not working. And a lot of us, I think, weren't aware. We thought we were having great progress, but okay, something's wrong. So, but we can't be race neutral, is what we're hearing. So, kind of with the new way of thinking by some. I don't know if everyone's quite aware of this new way of thinking yet or not, but I don't know. I don't know if that's quite a question. Maybe you can make something out of that. Talk about it. Thanks.
Sure. So one thing that I'd say in this is that public sentiment and case law are not one-to-one, right? Which is why I've at this point reiterated a few times that there's a process you have to go through. And so on one end of the spectrum is you not doing anything and maybe having some racial disparities or any sort of, because again, there's lots of different types of diversity. That doesn't need to be race, but that's what we're talking about at the moment. But, whatever, on one end of the spectrum is you're not doing anything and you have discriminatory outcomes, which puts your organization at risk from losing its federal funding due to Title VI and a lot of other federal requirements, actually. And then on the other end of the spectrum is having race or gender or whatever protected class-based requirements that people have to comply with, in a mandatory fashion, right? There's a lot of space in between those two endpoints. And in the process of getting from one to the other, it's highly likely that you're going to solve whatever your issue was before you ever make a requirement. And so I think the public sentiment is that people want their governments or their things to be aware that there are race and gender and other sorts of diversity-based disparities in terms of outcomes. And people, generally speaking, want there to be some sort of action performed to remediate those disparities. But exactly what those actions are, there's a lot of disconnect there in the communities, as well as kind of in just people's sentiment. So that's kind of how what I would say is that the whole notion of governments and things not seeing race, it actually hasn't been the case for a very long time, right? Like in Brown versus Board of Education, it kind of made this legal distinction between de facto discrimination and de jure discrimination, which is, say, one that has, you're an organization, so we're in the municipality of Anchorage, and maybe we as an organization inherit discrimination from the community at large, and the other being we're actively doing things that discriminate against people, right? Those are two separate types of discrimination. So there's a lot of case history, there's a lot of law, there's a lot of strategies and tactics and things that can be done to address the things. And so it's not a matter of necessarily saying that, you have to have these mandatory things, because a lot of the times, quite frankly, you don't. You just have to stop having things that have negative outcomes that you're practicing yourself most of the time. And doing that alone tends to fix a lot of issues.
Thanks. It's a tricky business, so that's why we need someone to specialize in it, I think. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you. So a particular focus of mine is around behavioral health services in the municipality and those individuals experiencing homelessness. How does the role of an equity officer inform work in those areas? In particular, right now, Anchorage has the country's largest shelter, the MASH shelter, with approximately 400 individuals in it. We just have a very urgent and pressing issue around homelessness, and one that needs to be resolved. But how do we do that? How do we do urgent work, particularly urgent, I guess I call it people care work, where we have, where we're affecting individuals' lives in a way that keeps the lens towards equity and respect when it feels like we're constantly responding to a crisis?
Yeah, on this particular issue, obviously the municipality has some roles to play. I think the position itself, there will be in our identification and what I would hope to be indices built around different sorts of outcomes that our community faces based on the different types of diversity that we have. I would hope those could be used as a further basis in what would need to be arguing for additional support. Obviously, and I didn't mention this before, but I'm from Southern California. Spent a lot of time in Washington State before coming here as well. Homelessness is a national issue. Obviously, Anchorage has not been spared this issue, and it's a direct result of a lack of federal funding and federal support for housing. And that is something that different states and different communities have to address within the means that they have. And almost nowhere in this country do cities or even counties have the means to adequately, fully address the needs that they have, because it's a collective issue, quite frankly. And so there are things that I think we can do in terms of making it easier to advocate for things, or being a collective action hub, or leveraging the positionality of the city towards collective action in certain respects. But it's definitely those things termed a wicked problem. Homelessness is a wicked problem. It's not something that can be solved by any one institution, any one group, and it's something that we kind of all have to play a part in. But I'm fairly confident that it will not be solved nationally until we have more federal support for housing, and you can kind of track homelessness directly aligned with lack of federal investment in housing.
Great, thank you. All right, not seeing anyone else in the queue. So this appointment will be before us at our
Mr. Chair,
Tuesday, April 20th.
do you
Go ahead, Ms. Alatel.
see Ms. Ennis's hand up?
Ms. Ennis, did you want to say something?
Well, if I could, Mr. Armstrong, I'm from the Department of Law, and I just wanted to note some of John, some of your questions between race conscious and race neutral, that almost all of Mr. Armstrong's words and answers to questions are both consistent with and in fact taken from some Ninth Circuit precedent, which is very difficult to follow. And it's also reassuring to me as an attorney that he's worked in Tacoma with programs that have to be compliant with that precedent. So I want to say, as an attorney, I'm very reassured that you come from an area where you've had to deal with very difficult Ninth Circuit precedents.
Yes, thank you. And yes, very difficult. And actually, Washington State has laws on its books that I believe make it even more difficult to do what we did there, what I did there, than what is on the books here in Alaska because of Initiative 200 in Washington State.
Great, thank you. All right, so seeing no one else in the queue, we will have this before us, the approval of the appointment at our meeting on Tuesday, April 27th. Look forward to the deliberation and the vote on that. Thank you so much, Clifford, for answering all of the questions, and looking forward to working with you in the future. With that, I'll go ahead and close this work session, and I will see everyone again at 12 noon.